So thank you very much for inviting me, and also congratulations on the fantastic new building. I look forward to coming back to it again, maybe sometime in the future. So I'm going to talk about now something completely different, which is the relationship between myself, my body, my virtual body. I'm going to talk in the context of virtual reality, robotics, artificial intelligence. And the idea is that we found some empirical evidence, which I'm going to describe, that challenges the notion of a self, because part of what makes us human is we have this idea that we have a kind of unified, unchanging self. And when you start to experiment with changing aspects of your body, that idea seems to be under challenge. So I'm going to try to show very quickly some evidence that the self is not wholly our body, it's not our attitudes, it's not our actions, it's not our cognition, it's not our intentions, and then some conclusions about that. So first of all, the body, and the idea is that we can rapidly have the perceptual illusion that our body has changed. So this is a very good example of this. This is something you can try later. So the subject is the one behind with his eyes closed, and the one in front is only needed for his nose. And what the experimenter is doing is she's tapping the nose of the subject, the one behind with his eyes closed, while synchronously moving his finger so that it touches the nose of the one in front. So what does the brain make of this? It could just say, oh, confusion, I don't know what's going on, but I think that we always like to have some kind of, the brain always likes to have, it's safe to have a hypothesis about what's going on here. And everything would be okay if you were just doing this, tapping your nose, but the problem is your arm is outstretched. So what hypothesis fits this situation? And it's that one. Like most of what I'm going to say today, it's impossible for me to describe this to you. You have to feel it. And about 80% of people will get this in a few seconds of this tapping. Here's a more well-known example, the rubber hand illusion. So the subject, the one behind the desk, sees a rubber hand in a plausible, anatomically plausible position in front of him, and his real hand, the corresponding real hand, is out of sight. And again, the experimenter is synchronously stroking the rubber hand and the real hand in the same position in both cases as far as possible. And again, the brain could just say, oh, I'm confused. It's like, I know what's going on. At a cognitive level, of course you know what's going on, but at the perceptual level and the proprioceptive level, the solution the brain gives is the rubber hand is your hand. And here's an example of how this works. Here, the one on the left is the rubber hand. They're just wearing gloves so that they don't have visual cues about what's their hand and what's their rubber hand. The experimenter is synchronously tapping and stroking both. And after a few seconds of stroking, you get this kind of response. So again, this is something you can try yourself. You just need a glove and a board, and you could do it. I can't describe it, you have to feel it. So how do we do this in virtual reality? In virtual reality, what we do is, rather than visual tactile synchrony, which we can also do, but the most powerful one is visual motor. So the first thing is you look down and you see a virtual body substituting yours. And in your whole life, whenever you've looked down and you've seen a body, it's your body. So it's the kind of huge prior that it's your body. And second, in your whole life, whenever you move your arm, you see your arm move. So when you see the virtual arm move, it helps to integrate the feeling that this is your body. This is a perceptual illusion. You know it's not your body, but that doesn't matter. It's really this strong feeling that this is your body. You can do the same thing. This is a stereo image with visual tactile and visual motor synchrony. So as this is the virtual body of the subject that you're seeing, and as the subject's moving around, the body moves the same. And also, when the virtual ball strikes the virtual body, there's little vibrators on the subject's body, and the vibrators are activated at that moment. So it gives the feeling of touch. So here you can have both visual motor and visual tactile synchrony. So these body ownership illusions, I just put this to show that they've been very well studied in virtual reality with the same results reproduced over and over again. It's a very well established result that you get this illusion of body ownership.
So we've come to University College London for a bit of a meeting about a technology called beaming. We're meeting Professor Mel Slater here. You're heavily involved in the project.
Right, yes.
And also joining us is Dr. Mavi Sanchez-Vives. Good morning, Mavi.
I'll wind this forward a bit. The interesting part comes later. So he starts talking with her. So she's in Barcelona, in reality.
What's it like at your end?
I'm in a lab. It's similar to the one where you are, or in a room where there is some equipment around, and also a camera, although I cannot see it because I'm wearing a head-mounted display, and actually the environment in which I can see is the one where you are, in London.
As well.
So
here's another example. So she's in London, and she was actually talking to a neuroscientist in Barcelona who studies the relationship between what you eat and brain functioning. And I'm just showing this one because of the very strong feeling that the journalist had when she'd spent several hours in this body, that she said one thing, that when she saw the first one, the one with the BBC, in the same body that she had, she felt a kind of disgust that someone else had been inhabiting her body. So you can get very strong reactions with these things. Now, you could argue that substitution of a real body by a virtual one or a robotic one is just like simply wearing different clothes, but it's also been shown you can get similar results with a direct brain interface. So this is something that Rafi Malach with Doron Friedman from IDC and Abda Kedar from CNRS did together in a project that we had, where the person is in the scanner here in the Weitzman, and this is happening in France, and the person in the scanner is producing the right signals that make the robot move forward. And an anecdotal aspect of this is that when someone later lifted up the robot, the person in the scanner felt a real shock, like, how dare this person lift me up without asking my permission. So now let's move on to attitudes. What's interesting is that when you change the body representation, there's several results now that show that you get changes in perception, attitudes, behavior, even cognition. So the example I'm going to give, again, really fast, is racial categorization. And the idea we had was whether embodiment techniques can influence one's implicit racial bias. It was a long shot when we did this experiment, but we did it. So we're using the implicit association test, and this is a rapid reaction time test where subjects have to pair categories and faces, and if they pair black faces with negative words and white faces with positive words faster than the other way around, this signifies implicit bias. That doesn't mean the person is explicitly biased. This reflects more our unconscious behavior, like you go on a bus and who do you unconsciously choose to sit next to? And if you're interested in this, there's loads of these tests on a website in Harvard. So when we did the first experiment, what we do is we measure the implicit association some days before the virtual reality exposure, and then we measure it afterwards. And what we typically get is these kind of results. The greyish one is people who are embodied in a white body, and what happens there whenever we do this, for some reason we don't know, the bias seems to increase. And this is a between groups experiment, so they don't know there's another group who are experiencing a black body. So those in the black body, the bias decreases, and those who had no body, which is the brown one, nothing happens, and those who had a purple body, nothing happens, and we use purple to check that our results were not due to difference, but really due to race. So the effect also lasts at least 1 week. The last experiment we did, which is this one, we measured the post-IAT 1 week after the virtual reality exposure. And I'll just show you a tiny piece of this, where what they were asked to do is follow the movements of a Tai Chi teacher, and we did this to make them move and see themselves in the mirror and see their own body. They either had a black body or a white body between groups. Another example of changing attitudes is some work we've been doing for a few years on domestic violence, and this is in conjunction with the Catalan Justice Department, where offenders, if they have been sentenced to less than 2 years, they can choose to go to prison or they can do a psychological retraining course, and our work's been incorporated in that course. This is pretty rough. What we do is we embody the offenders, in, I'll try this again. We embody the offenders in the body of a woman. They spend a little bit of time kind of looking in the mirror, moving. Here, for those of you who know, we're just using an HTC Vive hand and feet trackers for this. And then in comes in, here we maybe when it, in comes in a virtual man who then starts abusing the woman. I'll show you one particularly scary part. He starts verbally abusing the woman, who of course himself is a man.
And do you fucking see it? Yeah? Well, there goes the fucking phone. And you can forget about your fucking mobile as well. The only mobile in this house
later
is...
he breaks the distance. He comes very close. And we always make the character bigger than the real man. So the man unusually is having to look up like this, even though he's embodied in the body of a woman. So what we found, along with other previous literature, is that abusive men tend to have a deficit in recognizing fear in the faces of women. We found this in our study that we did, and then after the exposure, this deficit is substantially reduced. We also found that amongst convicted offenders, this exposure seems to reduce recidivism, but the data's too early to kind of really believe that yet. But so far, that's how it looks. Now, what about actions? Can we say, well, it's myself because I'm the one who does the actions? But no, what we found is that you can give people the illusion, when they have ownership over a virtual body, and that body does something that they didn't do, you can give them the illusion that they did it. In this case, it was speaking, so participants were embodied in a life-size virtual body. Either synchronous movements like you've seen, or the movements of the body were asynchronous. And at a certain moment, the body spoke 45 words. And the fundamental frequency of the voice was higher than the voice of the participant. So this one, well, actually, if this, yes, so the video is like, it's nothing very interesting. It's just they move and the body speaks and that's it. Or there's an asynchronous condition where they move, but the movements of the body are not their own, and the body speaks, and it's just 45 words. So we measure a baseline fundamental frequency of their voice. Then a few days later, they have the virtual reality exposure, and then immediately after, then during the exposure, there's the stimulus voice, and then immediately afterwards, we again measure the fundamental frequency. And what we were interested in was the difference of post minus pre. And so what happens is synchronous condition leads to much greater subjective body ownership, which of course we already knew, but also they have illusory agency over the speaking. They know it wasn't them speaking, but they say it feels like it was. And also, just look at the right-hand side. There was another condition I don't have time to describe, or look at either side. You see this huge difference between synchronous and asynchronous in this difference between post minus pre fundamental frequency. So not only did they have the illusion it was they who were speaking, but afterwards, only in the synchronous condition, did they also speak in a higher frequency themselves. You can also do this with illusory walking. We gave people although the people were seated, we gave them the illusion that they were walking, so the person is just seated, the only thing they move is their head. Then they go in the virtual reality, and it walks, and I don't know why the video is not moving, but I'll move it. And then when it walks up a hill, you can get detectable measures increase in heart rate and respiration. So not only do they have the illusion that they're walking, but their body also kind of responds as if they are. And in the asynchronous condition, in a third-person perspective condition where they see the body from the outside, that doesn't happen. Now, cognition, I'll just show a video. Can we have this one louder, please?
Please look down towards your body. Look at your right hand.
This is an embodiment procedure.
Look at your left hand.
It's me.
Now look in the mirror to your left. Raise your right arm. Raise your left arm.
The other side is Steve Jobs.
You can now put your arms down. When the light next to you...
Now I'm embodying myself as Steve Jobs.
You can now put your arms down. Listen to the person in front of you.
And so before I'd said
well,
this,
I'm giving a talk this week where I'm supposed to describe our work, but there's just so much to talk about, I don't know on what to focus.
Yourself.
And now, as Steve Jobs,
well,
I did this.
What is it that interests you? What is it that you're most excited about?
So I'm swapping bodies.
Why do you use virtual reality at all?
Having a conversation with myself. It doesn't
well,
make you schizophrenic.
I use virtual reality because you can achieve things in virtual reality that you just can't do in reality, which nevertheless can be very beneficial. But there's so many things we do like that, I'm not sure on what to focus.
Yourself.
Well, which is the one that inspires you the most?
And it's actually this one.
The one I like best.
Say that. So how does this work? It's, we can embody people as anybody, first-person perspective, real-time motion capture, and in particular, we can embody people as Sigmund Freud. Why Freud, I'll say later. So the way this works is, first of all, we scan the person to get a good representation of them, and then they talk, they're embodied as themselves, they see themselves in a mirror, and then they explain a problem to Sigmund Freud. And then they are in Sigmund Freud's body and they see and hear themselves explain the problem. And then it just keeps swapping backwards and forwards between, I know it sounds crazy, but they keep swapping backwards and forwards between the two conditions. So we did a first study, we found body ownership in the Freud body was high, and that's very interesting because remember the other body was really themselves. And this illustrates that body ownership is highly dependent on the multisensory stimulation, not on appearance. So whether they were embodied in Freud body or there were some other conditions I don't have time to describe, they all improved their mood and happiness simply because they talked about their problem. But those with body ownership in the Freud body had the better improvement. Why did we choose Freud? Because beforehand we wanted to have someone everyone would recognize. Beforehand we'd asked a sample of people, who would you like to explain a personal problem to? And to our surprise, number 2 came Angelina Jolie, and number 1 was Freud, so we had to go with Freud. We had a second study where you could be embodied, do the body swapping with Freud, or just speak to a simulated Freud who would ask you various pre-programmed questions. And the results of this were very good. That compared with a simulated Freud, they got better knowledge of their problem, better understanding, new ideas, better control, and it helped them. And also, if you look at the proportion of people who experienced a positive change, it's much higher in the body swapping condition. So a journalist from New York who came and embedded himself in our lab for a few days, and it's very interesting what he said and what he wrote about in the article, that he said, when I took off the headset, I was moved. I wanted to tell myself, good talk. From his perspective, being in Freud, I'd seemed a different, sadder, more ordinary, comprehensible. I told myself to remember that version of me. And later on the radio, in something called Radio Lab, he said, it's like the moment when you first realize your parents are just people. And for the first time, he realized, he himself is just another person. We also, I like doing crazy things. We embodied people as Einstein, or in a virtual body which more or less looked like them as was their same age. And what we found is that being embodied as Einstein, they improved on certain cognitive tasks, which was things like Tower of London puzzles, but only if they had high self-esteem, low self-esteem. If they had high self-esteem, nothing happened. If they had low self-esteem, they got this improvement. So I don't know why we haven't tried to, we tried to understand it, but we don't know the answers yet, but it's a very interesting result. The last one is intentions. So are we our intentions? Well, again, we can manipulate these. This is a very simple example we did a few years ago where we wanted to see, could reinforcement learning be used where a virtual character can get you to move to a certain position in the virtual reality without you knowing that this was your task. So it's a really simple idea. Basically, the agent learned the rules of proxemics. It learned that if it goes close to you, you'll back away. If it waves to you, you'll get closer. And what was really interesting, it learned that if you're too far away, that if it steps forward, nothing happens. It learned wave to the person, they come close, and then you step forward. So the people didn't know that this was their task, but basically in 7 minutes, the reinforcement learning had learned proxemics, and this was very successful compared to like just the character doing random backwards or forwards movements. And this method, we replicated it in a more complex locational situation. Also, we replicated it in a study of how people respond to violent incidents, where the virtual characters learned through reinforcement learning which behaviors to do to make the person intervene. So conclusions, what makes us human? So having a conscious self, where we have the illusion that we're in control and we're a unified entity, is obviously an important part of being human. But what is this self when it's so manipulable by these kind of very simple techniques? It's not our body. It's very strange when you go into the virtual body of like Freud or something, you have a different feeling about yourself. It's not your attitudes, it's not your actions, it's not your cognition, it's not even your intention. So I think coming decades will challenge the notion of self. Philosophers love this kind of work, by the way, through revolutionary technological advances that I think we're only still seeing the beginning of. So this work comes from mainly, it's European funded, ERC and FP7. And there's many people involved in many different aspects of this work. Thank you.
So, wonderful. So I suppose there will be many questions. Oops. Thank you. Fascinating and amazing stuff. So, thanks. I wanted to ask, what are the implications of this for video games, for avatar-based video games, where basically these kids are going around shooting things?
Yeah. No, that's very important because as for years we were working in virtual reality and no one told us the field had died. And for like, we started this work in 25 years ago. But it was too expensive to be used by the public. But now in the last few years, it's something that's publicly available. And no one knows what's going to happen because there's never been anybody who spent hours and hours and hours a week in virtual reality doing these kinds of things. So we've applied for funding a few times to try to do some long-term studies, but so far no one wants to. They all say great idea, but no one wants to fund it. So the answer is I don't know, but it is a bit worrying, yes. Yeah.
Did you, Ovid? Did you work with therapists in regards to inner parts work, like inner characters work, inner child work, and archetypal stuff?
Yes, we work with, we've never done anything at all with children, but we do work with clinical psychologists. So the study I showed you, whether you're swapping the body, this was with a clinical psychologist. And I've worked for many years with Dr. Daniel Freeman from University of Oxford, who studies paranoia. And first we showed that people do get paranoid. People who are paranoid in everyday life, they also have paranoia with virtual characters. And then he used it for many years as a tool to build a model of paranoia. And now finally he's turned it into a cognitive behavioral therapy that seems to work pretty well. It doesn't cure paranoia, but it allows people to go out into the street and kind of have a life and learn to kind of cope with their feelings.
Is there a noticeable difference in I'm trying to find the word, but with associating one with virtual body between people who are, how to say it, used to their body only, and people who tend to play tabletop games, for example, and other video games, when you actually play as another character, because from my experience at least, after some time you start to develop different personas that you use when you are in character than in real life.
Yes, so I think the difference is in the words you use after some time. So what happens on a video game is you're in a situation where you're working with characters who are this high. And what are you using? Your fingers to move. That's really different. It's a very qualitatively different feeling to be in a virtual reality, look down, and there's a body there. You move your real hand, and your virtual hand moves. It's really different. So what I'm saying is that this effect is pretty immediate. This body ownership is like with the rubber hand illusion. 80% of people get it in 20 seconds. So this feeling is, you look down, you see a body, it's there straight away. You don't have to kind of gradually get yourself into it over many hours of playing a game. So other than that, I've not done any studies on that, but it's a very interesting question to explore the difference between those two. So in the video games, you have to bring your own imaginal resources to it, and in the full life-size virtual reality, you don't. It's just there. It's already a perceptual illusion.
When I met Dan Zahavi from the Center of Subjectivity in Copenhagen with these ideas, he said all this is kind of external stuff, and he coined the idea of the minimal self. So yes. Nothing matters. And I was kind of intrigued by kind of the tension between the Cartesian idea, that there is that self and that we're just inside a vessel, as opposed to the Merleau-Ponty embodied cognition. And if you could comment, what do you think about that? And does that mean like the Ray Kurzweil idea that, finally we could just upload our conscious to some software because the body doesn't matter?
Well, I don't know about uploading our... So let me answer it this way. I believe that the brain, and probably the neuroscientists here could help with this, I believe the brain is incredibly adaptable to having a different body. So if we took somehow able to, effectively, if you think what we're doing with the robot body, in some sense, because we're transforming a lot of the person's perceptual apparatus to this other body, their consciousness is kind of in that body. So, and they don't say, wow, this is really strange, I can't bear it. They just move, they just do it. So somehow the brain is really adaptable to a change of body, and the implications of that about uploading our brains to robots so that we don't die, I mean, I'm not sure I'd want it, but I believe it could work, it could be done, yes.
One thing that we continuously do in order to verify that this is our body is to move it. You move the little finger, you verify that this is your body. With the rubber hand illusion, of course, it wouldn't work if you allow the subject to test, right, to move it. So yes. And the same with virtual reality. I have heard from many people, and when I experience it, after 10, 15 minutes, you feel so weird in this environment. I mean, you cannot really stay there and feel that this is real. You are cheated, but not all the way, because you cannot really sense in the virtual reality. You can sense every pips of movement and feedback. So basically, we have the feeling what is our real body and some kind of illusion. How are you going to deal with this?
So actually, two things. One is that the only experiment we've ever done that addressed your question is we had people go into a virtual reality 6 days running, half an hour a day. Nothing changed. In other words, their level of presence, their level of body ownership, their level of activity and interest, it stayed the same throughout that whole period. If anything, it increased. So the only data we have suggests that it doesn't wear off. You don't adapt. You don't adapt in the sense of saying, oh, I'm bored with this, I'll stop doing it. But the other thing is that, of course, virtual reality today is limited mainly to vision and sound, and you can get some kind of haptics, but not generalized haptics like you can get generalized vision. But over time, it will be the case that more and more of our senses are more and more accurately integrated into the virtual reality. My experience over the years, remember I started in 1991 where I looked down at my virtual body and it was a few polygons, right? And now it's more sophisticated, now it can be even like my real body. I don't feel any change. It was as good in those days. So somehow what's important is not also some experimental work shows that what's important is not the realism. It's the activation, it's the movement. It's I turn my head and I see the world over there, whereas before I was looking over here. So the important thing is the activation of sensory motor contingencies in virtual reality. It's not the realism, I think.
Yeah, it really comes close to what you just said. I am confused from the neurophysiological point of view. What is the role of the different sensory inputs and of the efferent motor copy in creating these illusions? If I, very, very primitively think about it, it seems to me that somatosensory input, including proprioceptive input, and the efferent motor copy are very important.
Yes.
But then you can fool them with vision.
Yes.
Because we are primates, or because of what? Vision is so
powerful,
strong.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes. So for me, the critical things are sensory motor contingencies that more or less like those of everyday life. So the fact I can use my body to perceive is really critical to give you the sense this is where you are. The other thing which is related to that, you look down. Most virtual realities you ever do, you'll look down and you're invisible. This is a really big shock. When you look down and you see a body, immediately the brain, it's my body, because as I said before, in your whole life, in the whole evolution of our species or animals, whenever you look down, you see the body, so it's your body. So the other interesting thing, and it relates to my piece on agency, is we have found that under careful conditions, that if you make the body do motor actions that you're not really doing, you'll also believe that you're doing it, and you'll start to do it, or at least start to match it. So the vision is very important, I agree, yes.
So a very last short question, Sarah.
Very short. Have any of the subjects or people that have done this had prosthetics? And if they have, what do they experience, or do they experience anything different?
We haven't. No, we haven't done that with people with prosthetics. No.
So
the only other thing to say of that, of course, you know the Ramachandran box illusion. So there was a group in Manchester who reproduced that in virtual reality, and they got the same results. So instead of seeing a reflection of your, if the right arm is gone, you see a reflection of the left arm in Ramachandran's work. Instead, they had a virtual arm that they saw, and they had the same effect as in Ramachandran's work.
Thanks very much.